92-year-old man has been found guilty at Bristol Crown Court of the rape and murder of 75-year-old Louisa Dunne back in 1967, in what is thought to be the UK's longest-running cold case ever to be solved.
For nearly 6 decades, the murder of a 75-year-old woman named Louisa Dunne haunted the memories of those who still remembered her name. It was a case that had long turned cold, frozen in the archives of history, left behind by generations that believed justice would never come. But time, as it often does, found a way to speak again. In 2025, Ryland Headley, a frail 92-year-old man, stood before a British court. His voice trembled with age, yet his past roared louder than ever. The charge? The rape and murder of Louisa Dunne, committed in 1967, a crime so brutal, so senseless, that even after half a century, it still echoed through Bristol's quiet streets. This was not just a trial. It was a reckoning, one that had taken 58 years to arrive. DNA technology, justice's most patient servant, had reached back through time and pulled an old name out of the shadows. For decades, Louisa Dunne's death had been described as a tragedy lost to history, an elderly widow found lifeless in her own home, her peace shattered by a faceless monster. The investigation was exhaustive, the community horrified. But without modern science, the case grew colder with each passing year. Now, after generations of silence, the truth had clawed its way back into the light. The revelation shocked not only those who had lived through that era but also a new generation, one that thought such darkness belonged only to the past. As the gavel fell and the truth finally emerged, one question lingered: how could a man live a lifetime carrying such a secret? This is the story of justice delayed, but not denied, the story of Louisa Dunne and the man who thought he had escaped time itself. Welcome to Unraveling Crimes, where forgotten cases breathe again. If you believe every story deserves an ending, make sure to subscribe, because today, we're reopening the case that time forgot. Before the darkness of 1967, Louisa Dunne lived a quiet and honorable life. She was a widow, a woman who had weathered the storms of war, loss, and time, yet still found peace in the small routines that made up her days. Her home sat on a modest street in Bristol, surrounded by friendly neighbors, neat hedges, and the sound of church bells that drifted through the air on Sunday mornings. At 75, Louisa embodied the kind of gentleness that seemed to belong to a different era. She was known by her neighbors as a kind soul, polite, composed, and unfailingly independent despite her age. Her life was one of simplicity and rhythm, tending to her small garden, exchanging warm smiles at the local grocers, and writing letters to the few relatives she still had. To those who knew her, Louisa represented everything the town of Bristol stood for in the late 1960s: safety, community, and the comforting illusion that evil was something that happened elsewhere. The United Kingdom was changing fast in that decade. The swinging 60s had brought color and youth, but for many older citizens like Louisa, life remained steady, traditional, and contained within familiar walls. She had lived through the Great Depression, survived the uncertainty of World War II, and now sought nothing more than peace in her twilight years. Neighbors often described how Louisa's window light would stay on late into the night, a small golden glow on a quiet street. They said she read the Bible before bed, that she never complained, and that her door was always open for those who needed a cup of tea or a listening ear. It was in this very home, the place she called her sanctuary, that she would meet her tragic end. What no one in Bristol could have imagined was that evil had already crept into their peaceful town. Somewhere, unseen and unremarkable, a young man named Ryland Headley walked the same streets. He was in his late 20s then, quiet, ordinary, and unknown to Louisa Dunne. But soon, their paths would cross in the most horrifying way possible. As night fell on that spring evening in 1967, no one could have predicted that Bristol's sense of safety was about to shatter. The town too peaceful for evil was about to become the stage for one of its darkest crimes. It was the spring of 1967, a mild evening in Bristol, where dusk settled slowly over the cobblestone streets. Louisa Dunne had been seen earlier that day by her neighbor, Mrs. Evelyn Clark, as she returned from the corner shop carrying a small brown paper bag. Inside were simple groceries, tea, bread, and milk, the humble provisions of her solitary life. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. Louisa's home stood quietly at the end of Westbury Lane, a place where nothing extraordinary ever happened. As night descended, her light, which usually flickered through her lace curtains, failed to appear. To her neighbors, it seemed unusual but not alarming. After all, she was an elderly woman, perhaps she had gone to bed early. But inside that small home, something terrible was unfolding. Sometime after nightfall, a man broke into Louisa's house. Investigators would later piece together that the back door had been forced open. The motive, at first, was assumed to be burglary, a desperate act by someone seeking money or valuables. But what followed was far more sinister. Louisa Dunne was attacked in her own bedroom, a place she had always considered her refuge. She was sexually assaulted and violently beaten, her frail frame no match for the brutality she endured. The violence was personal, relentless, and pitiless. The neighbors heard nothing. No cries. No struggle. Only silence, the kind that blankets a neighborhood unaware that a nightmare is taking shape behind one of its doors. The next morning, when Louisa's milk delivery remained untouched and her curtains stayed drawn, Mrs. Clark grew uneasy. By evening, concern had turned into quiet panic. She called the local constable, and together, they approached Louisa's home. When police forced entry, the air inside was heavy and still. The home looked undisturbed, the kettle still resting on the stove, a half-folded blanket on the armchair. But when they reached the bedroom, the illusion of peace shattered. There, they found Louisa Dunne's body. Her death was brutal, her dignity stolen, her life extinguished in a place meant to keep her safe. The small, quiet street that had always felt untouched by evil was now a crime scene. Within hours, word spread through Bristol like wildfire. Shock turned to fear, and fear to outrage. How could someone do this to an elderly woman, a pillar of the community? The police began their investigation immediately. But what they didn't know was that they were stepping into a mystery that would remain unsolved for nearly 6 decades. That night, under the glow of police lanterns and whispered prayers, the story of Louisa Dunne became something far more than local tragedy. It became a question that time itself refused to answer: who could commit such horror, and vanish without a trace? When officers from the Bristol Constabulary entered Louisa Dunne's home on that April morning in 1967, they were met with a silence that carried the weight of something unspeakable. It was the kind of silence that follows violence, heavy, unnatural, and unforgettable. Louisa lay lifeless on her bedroom floor. Her home, once a sanctuary of order and comfort, was now the scene of a brutal crime. The only sound in the room, marking time she would never know again. The detectives quickly realized this was no simple break-in. Nothing of real value had been taken. Her purse was untouched, her wedding ring still in her hand. What had been stolen was far worse: her safety, her dignity, and her life. The coroner's early examination confirmed what investigators feared: Louisa Dunne had been sexually assaulted and strangled. The brutality of the attack shocked even the most seasoned officers. Bristol, a city more accustomed to petty theft and domestic disputes, had rarely seen such savagery. By noon, the street was sealed off. Neighbors gathered behind police tape, whispering prayers and theories. Reporters soon arrived, their flashbulbs cutting through the somber morning. The headline would read, "Elderly woman found murdered in her home, police hunt attacker." Detectives began the difficult task of retracing Louisa's final hours. They interviewed neighbors, store owners, milkmen, anyone who might have seen something unusual. But there was nothing. No suspicious strangers, no sounds of struggle, no witnesses. The neighborhood's stillness had betrayed her. Officers searched for fingerprints, fibers, and footprints, but 1967 was an era before DNA testing, before modern forensics could speak for the dead. The evidence they collected was fragile, fragments of a puzzle no one yet had the tools to solve. The city mourned her. Churches held candlelight vigils, local newspapers called her a beloved soul lost to senseless evil. Yet beneath the grief, there was something else: fear. Fear that the person who did this might still be out there, walking among them, unseen and unpunished. Weeks turned into months. Every lead turned to dust. The police followed dozens of tips, questioned local laborers, transient men, and anyone with a criminal record in the area. Still, no one matched the crime. Eventually, the case began to fade. The officers who had first stood in that bedroom moved on to other investigations. New detectives inherited the file, but with no technology to advance it, Louisa's story became another cold case, a haunting entry in Bristol's criminal archives. For her surviving relatives, the wound never closed. They buried Louisa with quiet dignity, but the unanswered questions lingered. Who was the man who had taken her life? Why had he chosen her? And would he ever be found? As years passed and memories blurred, her name slipped from headlines into history. But the evidence, what little there was, remained sealed, waiting in the archives of Avon and Somerset police. What no one knew then was that decades later, those forgotten samples would speak again. And when they did, they would whisper the name Ryland Headley. In the weeks following Louisa Dunne's murder, the Bristol Constabulary poured every resource they had into the case. The crime was not only shocking in its brutality but unprecedented in the quiet city. The investigation drew national attention, with headlines capturing the horror that had struck the heart of a peaceful neighborhood. Detectives canvassed the area for witnesses. They retraced Louisa's last movements, from the grocer's shop to the post office, from her neighbor's visit to the moment she vanished behind her front door. They collected statements from anyone who might have seen something unusual. But the leads were as fragile as the spring air that day, and just as quickly, they disappeared. Dozens of men were questioned. A few were even arrested and released. There were rumors of a stranger seen lurking in the area. Others spoke of a local laborer who had abruptly left town after the murder. But with no fingerprints to match, no forensic breakthroughs, and no confession, each suspect dissolved into another dead end. Forensic science in the 1960s was limited. DNA analysis was decades away. The best investigators could do was rely on blood type matching, shoe impressions, and witness recollection, tools that often told only part of the story. Louisa's killer had left behind almost nothing. No weapon, no clear motive, no traceable evidence. As the months turned into years, the momentum slowed. The case file thickened with notes, interviews, and reports, but no answers. New crimes, new priorities, and shifting police leadership slowly buried Louisa Dunne's name under the weight of time. By the 1980s, the original investigators had retired. Some passed away still haunted by the unsolved murder that had once consumed their lives. For the Dunne family, there were no updates, no closure, just silence. Every few years, when technology advanced, the file was briefly reopened. Forensic teams revisited the evidence, examining fibers, clothing, and preserved biological samples that had miraculously survived the decades. But still, nothing matched. Louisa's case remained one of Bristol's oldest and most baffling cold cases. It was as if the killer had vanished into thin air. And yet, buried deep within the archives of the Avon and Somerset police, a small piece of evidence sat quietly, a preserved sample that would one day unlock the truth. But in the 1990s, even as DNA profiling began changing the world of criminal justice, this case remained overlooked. Then came the early 2000s. Advances in forensic genealogy and DNA reanalysis began to resurrect long-forgotten crimes. Across the UK, cold cases were being reopened, revealing long-hidden killers. Detectives began to wonder if Louisa Dunne's file, yellowed, dusty, and silent, could still speak. It would take more than half a century, but eventually, science would do what time could not. It would identify the man who thought he had escaped justice. The file number was still the same. The evidence label still bore her name. But when that sample was finally re-examined, the silence that had lasted 58 years was about to break. And the voice that emerged from that silence was DNA. For 58 years, Louisa Dunne's case sat in storage, a sealed envelope of tragedy, gathering dust in the archives of Avon and Somerset police. But in 2024, during a nationwide review of unsolved murders, detectives decided to re-examine that old evidence using the most advanced DNA technology available. The process was painstaking. A small biological sample collected from the crime scene in 1967, preserved, though degraded, was submitted for analysis. It was fragile, a ghost of genetic material from another century. But modern forensic science had evolved beyond imagination. Using next-generation DNA sequencing, experts were able to extract a profile, faint, incomplete, but distinct enough to speak. That DNA was entered into the UK National Database and cross-checked against thousands of profiles. Days passed. Then, a hit appeared. It matched a man, Ryland Headley, now 92 years old, living quietly in the south of England. To neighbors, he was an elderly recluse, soft-spoken, with no apparent history of violence. But to detectives, his DNA told another story. In the late 1960s, Ryland Headley had lived only a few streets away from Louisa Dunne. At the time, he was a young laborer, transient, unpredictable, with minor offenses on record but nothing that hinted at the monster within. He had slipped through the cracks of an era without forensic proof. Detectives obtained a fresh DNA sample from Headley under quiet surveillance. When the results returned, they confirmed it, an exact match to the DNA left at Louisa Dunne's home in 1967. The moment the confirmation came in, the room fell silent. Some officers described it as chilling, as though time itself had folded, and a ghost had finally pointed to its killer. 58 years after the murder, the name Ryland Headley was written across the case file that had long been marked unsolved. When investigators confronted him, Headley showed no emotion. Behind his frail frame and trembling hands was the same man who, decades earlier, had forced his way into an old woman's home and taken her life. His arrest would become one of the oldest cold case resolutions in British criminal history. News spread across the country. Reporters called it a triumph of science over time. For Louisa's distant relatives, some of whom were not even born when she died, it was a moment of disbelief and closure. The story that had faded into legend had suddenly become real again. For the detectives, it was a victory laced with sadness. The breakthrough came too late for Louisa to see justice served in her lifetime, but not too late for truth to prevail. Because, as investigators would later say in court, DNA never forgets. It remembers what witnesses cannot. It endures when silence falls. And in Louisa Dunne's case, it spoke for her, after 58 years of quiet waiting. In early 2025, detectives arrived at a small, quiet home in southern England. The man who answered the door was frail, stooped, and moving slowly with the help of a cane. His name was Ryland Headley, a 92-year-old pensioner whose face bore the weight of time, but whose past was about to come crashing back with full force. When officers informed him that he was being arrested for the 1967 rape and murder of Louisa Dunne, he reportedly said little. There were no protests, no shouts of innocence, only silence. As he was escorted into custody, neighbors looked on in disbelief. To them, Headley was just an old man living a quiet, solitary life. No one could imagine that beneath that frail exterior lived the shadow of a murderer. At Bristol Crown Court, the story unfolded like something from another century. Prosecutors presented the forensic evidence, the DNA match that connected Headley directly to the scene of Louisa's death. They described how he had broken into her home, assaulted her, and caused her death with what the judge later called a pitiless and cruel act. Headley showed no remorse as the details of his crime were read aloud. In the courtroom, time itself seemed suspended, the aging perpetrator facing the crime of his youth, the victim long gone, and a justice system finally able to close the circle. Judge Derek Sweeting KC delivered the sentence, life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 20 years. For most men of Headley's age, it was effectively a life sentence. You broke into her home, the judge said, his words cutting through the silence. You sexually assaulted her, and in doing so, you caused her death. It was an act of cruelty beyond comprehension. Reporters described the atmosphere in court as hauntingly still. Even those who had covered crime for decades were struck by the surreal image of a man in his 90s, frail, gray, and trembling, being held accountable for an atrocity committed when he was young and strong. For Louisa's surviving relatives, the moment was bittersweet. Some wept quietly. Others simply closed their eyes and let out the breath they had held for a lifetime. Justice delayed, one of them said to the press, but not denied. The case drew national headlines. It reignited conversations about cold case investigations, forensic technology, and the moral weight of time. Could a man live nearly an entire life, pretending to be ordinary, while carrying such a secret? For decades, Ryland Headley had blended into the fabric of normal society, unnoticed, unremarkable, unseen. But science had finally stripped away his disguise. And as the prison gates closed behind him, a chapter of Bristol's darkest history finally ended, not with vengeance, but with vindication. After 58 years, justice had come walking slowly, but it had come all the same. 58 years. Nearly 6 decades of silence, questions, and fading memories. Yet in the end, truth endured. For the city of Bristol, the conviction of Ryland Headley was more than the closing of a file. It was proof that time does not erase justice, it only delays it. The story of Louisa Dunne reminds us that every unsolved case is not just a mystery, it's a wound waiting to heal, a voice waiting to be heard. She was 75 when her life was taken, a gentle woman whose only crime was living alone in peace. For too long, her story was buried beneath the years, overshadowed by progress, and forgotten by many. But when her name resurfaced, so did the weight of what had been lost. This case stands as a testament to the power of forensic science, perseverance, and the quiet faith of investigators who refuse to give up. It reminds us that even when decades pass, even when witnesses die and memories fade, DNA never forgets. And as the world watched a 92-year-old man led away in handcuffs, it became clear, no one, no matter how much time has passed, escapes the reach of justice. Louisa Dunne's light, once extinguished, now burns again through her story. A reminder that silence can be broken, and that truth, no matter how long it takes, always finds its way home. If stories like this move you, if you believe that every victim deserves to be remembered, and that every unanswered case deserves to be reopened, then stay with us. Because here, on Unraveling Crimes, we bring the forgotten back to life, one story at a time. Subscribe, share, and keep watching, because somewhere out there, another voice is still waiting to be heard. This is not the end. It's only the beginning of hope after the silence.